The heat in Los Angeles during the summer of 1969 was the kind of dry, suffocating pressure that seemed to bake the very asphalt of the cul-de-sacs in Culver City. I remember the drive vividly, the way the steering wheel felt hot under my palms and the smell of the city, exhaust, dried grass, and that distant, salty hint of the Pacific. At the time, I didn't care about the weather. I was a man of 32, standing 6'2" and weighing a solid 215 pounds. I had spent the better part of my life in the ring, transitioning from amateur boxing to full contact karate, and I had the scars and the flattened nose to prove I wasn't just a spectator. To me, the world of martial arts was a world of hard physics. You had mass, you had velocity, and you had the endurance to take a hit until you could land one of your own. I had seen the clips of Bruce Lee on the television and in the magazines, and like most of the professional fighters I ran with, I was more than a little skeptical. We called him the movie star. We figured the camera was his best friend, hiding the flaws in his technique and exaggerating his speed with frame rate tricks that any Hollywood editor could master. I wasn't looking for a fight when I tracked down his home address, but I was looking for the truth. I wanted to see if this man, who weighed barely 145 pounds soaking wet, was actually the revolutionary he claimed to be, or if he was just the most successful salesman in the history of the martial arts. When I arrived at the house, there was nothing to suggest I was at the home of a burgeoning icon. It was a modest place, quiet and unassuming. The garage door was cracked open about a foot to let some air circulate, and as I walked toward it, I could hear a sound I had never heard in any dojo before. It wasn't the rhythmic thump-thump of a boxer on a bag. It was a sharp, high-frequency staccato, a series of cracks that sounded more like someone was snapping a wet towel against a marble slab, over and over again, with impossible mechanical precision. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped into the shade of the garage. The air inside was 10 degrees hotter than it was outside, thick with the smell of liniment, old leather, and the heavy, humid scent of a man working at his absolute limit. Bruce was there, but he didn't look like the character from the television shows. He was wearing a simple, sweat-drenched grey sweatshirt with the sleeves hacked off at the shoulders and a pair of dark, flexible trousers. He was facing a heavy bag that had been modified with extra layers of industrial tape and what looked like high-density foam. He didn't stop when I entered. He didn't even look at me. He was in the middle of a drill that redefined my understanding of human biology within the first 30 seconds of watching it. There were 2 other guys in the garage, students of his, I assumed. They were sitting on a low wooden bench against the wall, one of them holding a heavy mechanical stopwatch and a notepad. They didn't speak to me. They just watched Bruce with a quiet, clinical focus that felt more like a laboratory observation than a training session. Bruce was in a lead-right stance, his feet positioned with an economy that made him look like he was floating just a fraction of an inch above the concrete floor. Then the stopwatch clicked. What followed was a blur of motion that my brain struggled to categorize. He began firing straight lead kicks into the center of that reinforced bag. In my world, a kick was a process. You chambered the knee, you rotated the hip, and you snapped the leg. Bruce bypassed the entire sequence. His foot moved from the floor to the bag in a straight, diagonal line that seemed to ignore the law of inertia. It was a piston-like movement, a continuous stream of impacts that didn't allow the bag to swing. The bag, which must have weighed at least 150 pounds, was held in a state of constant vibration by the sheer frequency of the strikes. I tried to count the kicks, but I lost the rhythm almost immediately. It wasn't 1, 2, 3. It was a hum of violence. I could see the muscles in his back and shoulders rippling under the sweat-soaked fabric. But his face was a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He was breathing in sharp, rhythmic bursts through his nose, his chest barely rising or falling. By the time the stopwatch clicked at the 60-second mark, the student with the notepad made a quick scribble. The number he whispered was 408. I stood there in the silence that followed, the only sound being the creak of the heavy bag's chains as it finally began to settle. Bruce took a small sip of water from a thermos, his eyes finally meeting mine. There was no arrogance in his gaze, just a quiet, piercing intensity that seemed to be measuring my weight, my reach, and my intent all at once. I told him I had seen his work and that I was a tournament fighter who didn't believe in the speed I'd seen on the screen. I told him that in a real exchange, mass usually wins. Bruce didn't argue. He didn't give me a lecture on philosophy or the flow of water. He just looked at the thin leather mitts he had on his hands, gloves he had designed himself to allow for both striking and grabbing. And then he looked at a pair of 16-ounce sparring gloves sitting on the bench. He asked me if I wanted to find out where the mass went when the speed was real. I didn't hesitate. I stripped off my shirt, put on the gloves, and stepped onto the concrete. The space was tight, maybe 12 by 12 feet of usable floor, surrounded by weight racks, a wooden dummy, and the heavy bags. There was no ring, no padding, and no referee. It was just the two of us in the sweltering heat of that garage, with the two students acting as the only witnesses to what I was sure would be a very short lesson for the smaller man. We began to circle. I moved in the way I had been trained. Chin tucked, hands high, weight slightly back on my heels to allow for a powerful lead jab. Bruce didn't take a traditional stance. He was fluid, his weight shifting constantly, his lead hand flickering in front of him like a snake's tongue. I felt confident. I had 40 pounds on him and a reach advantage that should have kept him at bay. I threw a probing left jab, a fast shot meant to test his reaction time. I didn't miss because he stepped back. I missed because he wasn't there. He moved just enough, perhaps 2 inches to the side, and as my glove passed through the empty air where his head had been, I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my lead shin. He had kicked my leg at the exact moment I committed to the punch. It wasn't a karate kick with a snap. It was a stop hit that used my own forward momentum against me. The impact sent a jolt up my leg that made my knee buckle for a split second. I reset. Feeling the first twinge of genuine concern, I tried to close the distance again, this time throwing a double jab followed by a heavy right cross. This was my bread and butter combination, the one that had sat many men down in the ring. Bruce didn't retreat. He did something that defied my fighting instincts. He stepped into the path of the punches. The physics of the next 10 seconds were a nightmare. Because he stepped inside my reach, my long punches became useless. They were looping over his shoulders while he was perfectly positioned in the pocket. His hands began to move in short, vertical bursts, what he called chain punching. They weren't the long, wind-up shots I was used to. They were short, 4 to 6 inch strikes that carried the weight of his entire body. Pop, 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 pop. The sound of his mitts hitting my chest and chin was like a drum roll. Each strike didn't just hurt. It disrupted my balance, pushing my head back and preventing me from planting my feet to fire back. I felt like I was being hit by a high-pressure fire hose. I tried to clinch, to use my superior weight to smother him and take him to the ground, but he was like trying to grab smoke. The moment I reached out to wrap him up, he was gone, pivoting on his lead foot and appearing on my flank. He hit me with a short side kick to the thigh that felt like being struck by a baseball bat, then followed it up with a back fist to my temple that made my vision swim. I realized then that I wasn't in a fight in the way I understood the word. I was being dismantled by a man who saw the geometry of the human body in a way I couldn't even comprehend. The heat in the garage seemed to intensify. I was gasping for air, the 16-ounce gloves feeling like lead weights on the ends of my arms. Bruce, conversely, looked like he was just beginning to find his rhythm. He wasn't sweating any more than he had been during the bag work, and his movement was becoming even more economical. Every time I twitched a muscle to attack, he was already countering. It was as if he was reading the electrical signals in my brain before my limbs could even move. I decided to try one last desperate tactic. I knew I couldn't outbox him or outkick him at this speed, so I decided to use a spinning back kick, a high-risk, high-reward move that used the full centrifugal force of my weight. I stepped, turned my hips, and launched the heel of my foot toward his midsection with everything I had left. In any other fight, this would have either ended the match or at least forced my opponent to bail out. But Bruce didn't bail out. He didn't even move back. As I began the rotation, Bruce saw the telegraph in my shoulders. Before I was even halfway through the spin, before my foot had even left the floor for the final arc, he stepped deep into my space. He intercepted the rotation at its weakest point. He didn't just block me, he hit me with a flying side kick that caught me square in the solar plexus at the exact moment my back was to him. The force was astronomical. I felt the air leave my lungs in a violent, involuntary wheeze. My feet left the concrete floor, and I felt a brief moment of weightlessness before I crashed into the reinforced heavy bag I had watched him hit earlier. The bag absorbed some of the impact, but I still slumped to the floor, my vision tunneling, and my chest feeling like it had been crushed by a hydraulic press. I sat there on the cold concrete, gasping for air that wouldn't come, my ears ringing with the silence of the room. The two students didn't move. They didn't cheer, and they didn't laugh. They just watched. Bruce walked over and stood above me. He didn't look like a victor celebrating a win. He looked like a scientist who had just confirmed a hypothesis. He reached down with his right hand, not to offer a good game handshake, but to firmly pull me back to my feet. He didn't wait for me to recover my breath before he began to speak. His voice was calm, almost academic. He explained that my mistake wasn't a lack of strength or a lack of courage, but a lack of empty space. He told me that because I was so focused on my own mass, I had become a prisoner of my own momentum. He spoke about the 400 kicks, not as a feat of athleticism, but as a necessity of the art. If you can only kick once every 2 seconds, he said, you are living in a world of seconds. But if you can kick 10 times in 1 second, you are living in a world of milliseconds. And the man who lives in the milliseconds will always defeat the man who lives in the seconds. I spent another hour in that garage, but not as an opponent. I sat on that wooden bench and watched him go back to work. He went to the wooden dummy, a strange apparatus with 3 arms and a single leg, and he began to move around it with a speed that made the earlier bag work look like a warm-up. The sound of his hands striking the wood was a continuous, rhythmic clatter. Tack, 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 that seemed to fill the entire neighborhood. He was practicing the same interceptions he had used on me, the same stop hits and pivots, but he was doing them with a level of intensity that suggested he was fighting an invisible version of himself that was even faster than he was. I watched the way his muscles moved under his skin, not bulky, show muscles, but long, wiry strands that seemed to be made of piano wire and steel. I realized then that the trick I had come to find didn't exist. There were no wires, no hidden edits, and no camera magic. There was only a level of discipline and physical mastery that bordered on the fanatical. By the time the sun began to drop below the horizon, casting long orange bars of light through the gap in the garage door, Bruce finally stopped. He walked over to a small sink in the corner of the garage, splashed some cold water on his face and neck, and then took a small towel and began to wipe down the equipment. It was a mundane, domestic act that stood in stark contrast to the violence I had just experienced. He handed me my shirt, which was still draped over the weight rack, and gave me a short, respectful nod. He didn't ask me if I believed him now. He didn't have to. The bruises forming on my ribs and the ache in my shin were all the proof I needed. As I walked back to my car, my body felt heavy and slow, as if I were moving through water. I looked back at the garage one last time. Bruce was already resetting the heavy bag, adjusting the tape, preparing for whatever his next session would be. He wasn't a movie star in that moment. He was just a man in a hot garage, obsessed with the pursuit of a reality that the rest of us were too slow to even see. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the sound of those 400 kicks per minute still echoing in the back of my mind. I thought about the tournaments I had won and the trophies on my mantle, and I realized they belonged to a different era, a slow, clunky era of weight and mass. I had seen the future of combat in a garage in Culver City, and it was a future that moved so fast it didn't even leave a shadow. For years afterward, whenever I would hear someone scoff at the speed of Bruce Lee or claim his feats were the product of Hollywood editing, I would think back to that afternoon. I would remember the heat, the smell of the leather, and the feeling of my own 215 pounds being suspended in the air by a man who moved like lightning. The world wanted to believe in the myth, but I knew the truth was much more terrifying. The truth was that he was exactly as fast as he seemed, and the only reason the cameras had to be slowed down was so the rest of the world could pretend they understood what was happening. He didn't break physical reality. He just proved that our understanding of it was far too limited. I never fought professionally again after that day, not because I lost my nerve, but because I had seen what true mastery looked like, and I knew that for the rest of my life, I would just be moving in slow motion. That was the real lesson of the 400 kicks. It wasn't about the number, it was about the fact that once you've seen the world in milliseconds, you can never go back to living in seconds. The silence of the garage as I left was the loudest thing I had ever heard. A quiet reminder that while we were all playing at being fighters, there was one man who had turned his very existence into a weapon that didn't know how to miss. The lesson didn't need a moral, and it didn't need a lecture. It was written in the sweat on the floor and the dent in the bag. It was the realization that the most dangerous man on earth isn't the one with the biggest muscles, but the one who has mastered the space between the heartbeats. As I pulled into my own driveway, I looked at my hands and saw they were still shaking. Not from fear, but from the sheer kinetic memory of being in the presence of something that shouldn't have been possible, yet was as real as the concrete beneath my feet.